Orangeburg, a small town in the heart of South Carolina. In 1968, this small town experienced a very brutal and devastating incident. Despite how severe and intense the Orangeburg Massacre was, this tragic occurrence seems to have been largely forgotten by mainstream history. The massacre claimed the lives of 3 Black students and inflicted serious injuries on 28 others. This was just a few months before the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., and at the intensity of the civil rights movement during the amplitude of racism across the United States. Unlike other tragedies related to civil rights, like the Kent State shootings, this tragedy did not receive widespread media coverage or national outrage. Today, the Orangeburg Massacre remains a chapter in the struggle of America's racial violence and injustice that is often looked down upon. But why is this awful event looked down on, despite being one of the earliest deadly police brutalities against Black students? What led to the sudden burst of tensions that caused the law enforcement personnel to release fire on a group of unarmed students at South Carolina State College? And very importantly, why has this ancient tragedy been widely overlooked by the public and historians and remained in the shadows? In this video, we'll explore all these and more about the tragic story of the Orangeburg Massacre, looking down to the night of 8 February 1968 that determined the fate of some Black students. We'll explore why students were peacefully protesting, how the protest turned to a deadly war, and what happened after the civil rights movement. Let's begin. During the 1960s, the era was characterized by sudden violence, upsets, and resistance, which caused the civil rights movements to rapidly gain momentum across the United States. As of the time, Black Americans, especially in the South, were contending for their basic human rights, demanding a stop to segregation, suppression of voters, police brutality, and racism with the system that had denied them full citizenship. In 1968, the civil rights movements have recorded some remarkable achievements, like the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. However, racial inequality was still highly prevalent, and most Southern states were still heavily segregated. Protesters experienced violent backlash, especially from the law enforcement. It was in this highly dense atmosphere of tension between the forces and the civilians that the Orangeburg Massacre took place. While the national gaze was heavily poised toward personalities like Martin Luther King Jr. and landmark events like the March on Washington, smaller local struggles were waged across the country. A good example is Orangeburg, South Carolina, a town that would soon become a battleground, a scene of a horrific tragedy. South Carolina State College, now South Carolina State University, was at the forefront of this battle for racial equality. A historical Black college, HBCU, served as an intellectual and cultural domain for the Black community in Orangeburg. Just like most HBCUs as of the time, South Carolina State College had a crucial role to play in the civil rights movement, as the students were usually at the forefront of the protests to end segregation and racial inequality. HBCUs trained a generation of Black leaders, scholars, and rights activists who were intentionally determined to challenge the system of racial oppression. Students of the South Carolina State College happened to be at the forward position of the movement, just like other HBCUs, organizing demonstrations and putting their lives to risk trying to fight for a change. During late 1969, Orangeburg was still experiencing segregation, just like other towns in the southern region. Public centers like restaurants, theaters, and recreation were still going heavy on racism. A good example is the All-Star Bowling Lanes, which was a whites-only establishment in town. Despite the fact that the Civil Rights Act of 1964 had legally ended segregation in public establishments, businesses in the South neglected it and continued to defy the law. The disregard for federal law became a source of frustration for Black students who attended Carolina State College. Their repeated denial of accessing the All-Star Bowling Lanes yielded a desire to take a stand and pursuit for what they want. It was this act of defiance from the bowling alley's owner that sparked the fuse that led to the protests to come. In early 1968, students across the nation were deeply engaged in peaceful protests, employing sit-ins, marches, and demonstrations to contend for their rights. This movement was inspired by the likes of Martin Luther King Jr. They embraced the technique of civil disobedience, believing that peaceful resistance would force the nation to confront the moral and ethical failures of segregation. South Carolina State College students were in no way different. They had enough and were tired of being perceived as second-class citizens in their own hometown. They decided to take matters into their own hands and execute direct action. On February 5th, 1968, some black students attempted to enter the all-star bowling lanes and were denied service as usual. This was not just an isolated incident, but a repeated event of despising the federal law mandating desegregation. They got involved in a verbal confrontation with employees, the police were called, and several students were arrested for trespassing. The following day, the students returned with a larger number, full of determination to peacefully protest against the racial practices of the bowling alley. In the process, they experienced resistance from the business owner and also from the local law enforcement. What had earlier started off as a peaceful exercise had suddenly turned into a combat between the students and the police. This time, the response from the police was more aggressive. Law enforcement officers mounted guards around the building. Suddenly, the confrontation between the officers and the students escalated. Even though the students remained nonviolent, the officers attempted to forcefully disseminate the crowd. On the 7th day of February, the tension in the small town of Orangeburg began to increase and remain at the peak. The students had gotten more support from their peers, and their determination to desegregate the bowling alley was steadfast. On the flip side, the local authorities were also preparing for a confrontation, deploying police officers and the National Guard in readiness for more protests. The students' peaceful protests had provoked the racial white establishment in the town, and the local authorities are afraid of more unrest, which made them to respond forcefully. On that very day, students had gathered on the South Carolina State College campus to strategize for the ongoing protests and plan further actions. Unknown to them, the local law enforcement was closely monitoring them and were increasingly anxious on what the whole situation is about to look like. Suddenly, the nearby police began to intensify and become more aggressive. The law enforcement began to deploy heavily armed officers, and members of the South Carolina National Guard were also deployed to curb the situation and maintain order. The nonviolent students soon realized that they are up against well-armed police officers with rifles and geared for riots. The confrontation for most of the time remained verbal, but the tension in the atmosphere was rapidly moving to a more intense gear, ready to explode. In the evening of that same day, 7th February, an incident occurred that made the situation more intense. As students assembled outside the campus environment, a fire broke out, probably resulting from an object hitting a bonfire. Though no one was severely injured, it marked the beginning of a standoff between the students and the law enforcement. The fire spurred fear among the authorities that the protests suddenly turned into a chaotic situation, although there was no evidence that the students intended in engaging in a fight. The presence of the National Guard and the state police gave room to a drastic shift in how the situation was being handled. Who would have thought that a peaceful civil rights movement would turn out to be a chaotic civil unrest? The deployment of military forces against unarmed college students was a clear sign that the authorities were all out for what was coming. They were fully prepared for a quell demonstration. Still, in that evening, law enforcement officers had surrounded the South Carolina State campus. Many of the students who were still finding their balance from the earlier arrests assembled in defiance, demanding justice for the discrimination they had earlier faced and the approach of the police response. At this point, both the National Guard and the local police were on high alert, with high expectation of more confrontation. Despite the high volume of tension, the students were still committed to not engaging in violence. Yet the presence of armed police created an atmosphere where the littlest spark can lead to a very dangerous, chaotic situation. That evening, on the 8th of February 1968, over 200 students were gathered in the front of the campus's Felton Gymnasium. They were angry and frustrated about the whole arrest and violent beating of their peers. At around 10:30 p.m., some students lit a bonfire which was meant to be for warmth. but the authorities interpreted it as an act of defiance, a sign that the students were preparing for violence. At some point, a police officer was struck by a heavy object. It was later reported as a banister or a rock. It was unsure where the object came from, and some witnesses believe it was thrown by a single individual, not the group. Regardless, the officers interpreted this as a hostile act, a signal that the situation was getting out of control. Without warning, the South Carolina Highway Patrol officers began to open fire on the unarmed black students who meant a peaceful protest. In a terrifying barrage, approximately 70 rounds were fired into the crowd over a span of about 10 to 15 seconds. The students who were caught completely off guard dispersed in fear, some running for cover while others lay flat on the ground, trying to protect themselves from the gunfire. The atmosphere was thick and covered with chaos. Students screamed and sought for safety, while law enforcement officers continued to fire indiscriminately into the crowd. Some of the students had no idea what was happening until it was too late. They were not armed, nor were they in any form of threatening the police. And yet, in those few horrific seconds, the peaceful protest turned into a bath filled with blood. That night, 3 young men lost their lives. Innocent young individuals who waved goodbye to their parents, unknown to them that this was their last. Samuel Hammond, an 18-year-old South Carolina State freshman, was fatally shot in the back. Henry Smith, a high school senior just 17 years old, was also struck and killed by police bullets. And Delano Middleton, also 17 years of age, a local high school student who wasn't even a protester, but was simply sitting on the steps of the gymnasium, was shot and killed as well. As though this wasn't enough, 28 other students were wounded, many of them suffering severe injuries from the gunfire. Some were hit by bullets as they tried to run for their dear lives. Others were struck while lying down, defenseless against the onslaught. Some eyewitnesses described the scene as one of complete terror. Students later described how the sounds of gunfire echoed through the campus, blending in with the screams of their injured fellow students. Many of them were standing far from the source of the thrown object, which makes it clear that the officers were firing indiscriminately into the crowd, not targeting anyone specific. One student survivor recalled, "I heard the gunfire and hit the ground. All I could think was, this is it. This is how I die." Another survivor, who had been close to one of the victims, described watching in horror as his friend was struck down beside him. When the chaos had cooled off, students helped carry the injured to safety. The scene became eerily quiet. The shock and disbelief that such a massacre could take place on their campus, a place they considered a safe haven for their activism, wasn't even safe enough. The police later claimed that they had been attacked by the students, a justification for their violent response. However, this claim was quickly debunked since no guns were found among the students, and eyewitness accounts confirmed that the students were unarmed. Despite this, the media coverage of the event was minimal since the students were running for their lives. Many national outlets and publications overlooked the tragedy and focused on the police's narrative of the incident. Unlike the Kent State shooting 2 years later, which caused national rampage, the Orangeburg Massacre didn't have significant media attention. The victims were black, the town was small, and the civil rights movement was already in a turbulent and dangerous phase. The massacre and the lives lost that night faded into the background of a nation already struggling with racial unrest and violence. After the Orangeburg Massacre, the campus was in grief. Bodies lay in pools of blood, and the wails of students echoed through the night as they tried to get a grasp of what had just happened. The once peaceful campus had become a battlefield stained with blood, and the scars of that night would not be forgotten, running deep for years to come. In a moment, the emergency response team pulled up on the scene to attend the wounded, but for the 3 young men, Samuel Hammond, Henry Smith, and Delano Middleton, it was too late. Some of the surviving students were severely injured and were hurriedly rushed to local hospitals. However, the community wasn't just mourning the dead, but also confronting the tragic horror that this incident caused. It's shocking how the country remained mute as the Orangeburg community was in grief. A few days after, South Carolina's Governor Robert McNair addressed the massacre in a press conference. His narration portrayed the students as the aggressors and offenders, which was widely spread, disregarding clear evidence of the direct opposite. No weapons were ever found on the students, and multiple eyewitnesses confirmed that they had been unarmed throughout the entire protest. Governor McNair's statement promoted distrust between the Black community and the state government. This was also an insult to the families of the victims and the injured. It was clear that the state had more interest in protecting the reputation of law enforcement than seeking justice for those who had been killed. McNair later admitted that the massacre was a mistake, but the damage was already done. The official narrative of student violence had been set, and it would take years for the truth to be fully acknowledged. What a pathetic mistake. The federal government investigated the incident, and instead of seeking accountability for the officers who had opened fire on unarmed students, the focus was shifted toward the students themselves. 9 South Carolina Highway Patrol officers were brought to trial in federal court on charges of excessive force. Despite the clear evidence that they had fired into a crowd of unarmed students, all 9 officers were acquitted. The defense argued that the officers acted in self-defense, that their lives were in danger due to the supposed aggression of the students. As though the injustice wasn't enough, Cleveland Sellers, a well-known student activist and member of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, was arrested after the massacre. Although he had not been directly involved in the shooting, Sellers was charged with stirring up a riot, making him the scapegoat for the violence. The height of justice, Sellers was convicted and sentenced to a year in prison. His conviction stood as the only one connected to the events of the Orangeburg Massacre. Sellers' unjust imprisonment shows how the justice system went against Black activists during the Civil Rights era. While those responsible for the deaths and injuries of innocent students walked free, a young man who had committed no violent act was made to serve time, a glimpse of injustice faced by the Black community. For decades, the survivors and their families fought for the truth and justice of the Orangeburg Massacre to be recognized. In the 1990s, fresh efforts were made to draw attention to the injustice that took place that night, with some historians and activists moving for the re-examination of the incident and the legal outcomes. In 2001, Cleveland Sellers' conviction was finally overturned, and he was formally pardoned, but for many, this wasn't enough. The Orangeburg Massacre, despite being one of the first major incidents of police violence against student protesters during the Civil Rights era, remains relatively unknown in the broader national consciousness. While tragedies like the Kent State shooting in 1970, where 4 white students were killed, are widely remembered and discussed, the Orangeburg Massacre has largely been relegated to the margins of history. In many ways, this erasure reflects the broader tendency to downplay or forget the struggles and tragedies of Black Americans, especially when they occur in places removed from the centers of national power. For years, the Orangeburg Massacre existed as a footnote in the civil rights movement, known primarily to the local community, the families of the victims, and civil rights scholars. The massacre also left a mark on the families of the victims and survivors, many of whom carried the trauma of that night for the rest of their lives. The fact that no justice was served in the trials that followed only deepened their grief and anger. For the community of Orangeburg, the massacre became a symbol of both loss and resilience. This was a painful chapter in the long history of the fight for racial justice. For so many decades, efforts have been put into preserving the memory of the Orangeburg Massacre. This was largely pioneered by survivors, activists, and local historians who refused to let the tragedy fade into extinction. These efforts gained more visibility in the 1990s and early 2000s as historians and civil rights scholars began to re-examine the events and bring them to the public consciousness. The legacy of the Orangeburg Massacre is a testament of both tragedy and resilience. While the massacre itself is a tragic moment of horrific violence, the persistence of the survivors and the families of the victims to keep the memory alive portrays the strength of the Black community in the face of systemic injustice. The massacre serves as a reminder of the cost of racial progress and the lengths to which authorities will go to maintain their reputation. But do you think the authorities were right? I'd love to get your opinions in the comments. Don't forget to leave a like and subscribe.